On the morning of March 12th, William Mulholland came to the St. Francis Dam because the dam keeper had seen muddy leakage. The reservoir stayed full. Before midnight, the dam was gone. That is the case in its narrowest form. A warning came from below the wall. The man with the most authority in the system arrived to inspect it. He saw nothing that made him empty the reservoir. Roughly 12 hours later, about 12.4 billion gallons of water were moving down San Francisquito Canyon. The first record is quiet. A local keeper notices something wrong. A chief engineer comes to look. The official judgment is calm enough that no emergency drawdown follows. The second record is not quiet. Concrete no longer holds. A reservoir leaves the place built to contain it. Downstream, people who had no practical way to judge the dam for themselves are suddenly living inside the decision made above them. The question is not whether a warning existed. It did. The harder question is why the warning could reach the highest authority in the system and still leave the reservoir full. Danger spoke through water, through color, through leakage that looked different enough for the dam keeper to call upward. Then the system did what it had been built to do. It sent the question back to one man's judgment. St. Francis was not just a wall in a canyon. It was storage for Los Angeles water, a curved concrete gravity dam, meaning a dam that depends mainly on its own weight to hold back the pressure of the reservoir behind it. It belonged to the Los Angeles aqueduct system, a larger civic machine built to bring imported water to a growing city. The dam stood in San Francisquito Canyon, but its meaning reached far beyond the canyon. It was part of the promise that Los Angeles could keep expanding because the Bureau could keep delivering water. That matters because St. Francis was not designed, checked, and operated by separate powers. It was designed and constructed by the Los Angeles Bureau under Mulholland's supervision. The same authority that built the dam also read its behavior. There was no independent review of the design. Independent review means a qualified outside check by people who are not responsible for the original work. A second engineering authority, a second reading of the ground, the design, and the assumptions. At St. Francis, that second reader was missing. Mulholland had earned unusual trust. By 1928, that trust had become more than reputation. It had become procedure. His office designed, his office built, his office inspected, his office interpreted. That does not mean Mulholland was careless. The record is more serious than that. The problem was that one office had been allowed to carry too much of the question alone. When a dam is holding back a full reservoir, confidence is not enough. Confidence does not test rock. It does not widen concrete. It does not challenge the calculation that first put the structure in place. But for St. Francis, confidence had become part of the operating system. Tony Harnischfeger saw the dam from a different position. He was the dam keeper. He was not reading the structure from a public office or a hearing room. He lived close to the wall, close enough to notice water where water should be watched, close enough to see when leakage changed character. Local historical summaries identify Harnischfeger as the dam keeper who warned Mulholland about muddy leakage that morning. The exact words of the warning are not verified here. They should not be invented. The fact that matters is plain enough. On the morning of March 12th, the keeper saw muddy leakage and raised the concern upward. That gave the last day its shape. Below the wall, a local observer saw a physical sign. Above him, the chief engineer came to interpret it. Between them stood the full reservoir. Muddy leakage was not a detail. Clean seepage can be easier to explain away. Seepage is water moving through or around a dam. Some seepage can be expected in hydraulic structures, but muddy water can carry a sharper meaning. It may suggest that water is not only passing through, but carrying material with it. That does not prove a failure sequence by itself. It does not tell the whole technical story, but it explains why the morning warning mattered. Harnischfeger did not need to solve the dam. He needed to report what he saw. He did. Mulholland came. Then the reservoir remained full. The fatal assumption was not that no one looked at St. Francis. The fatal assumption was that the same authority that had built and accepted the dam could also be the final authority on whether its warning signs were dangerous. That assumption had a history. Before the last inspection, leaks and cracks were not absent from the record. Engineering summaries describe leaking cracks and abutment seepage that had been observed and dismissed as typical. An abutment is the canyon side where a dam ties into the rock. The word typical can sound reassuring. Sometimes it is. Not every crack means collapse. Not every leak means emergency. Large hydraulic structures can have water in places that require monitoring, not panic. But typical can also become a dangerous category. Once a system has decided that leakage belongs inside the normal range, new leakage has to fight its way out of that old interpretation. On March 12th, the sign that reached Mulholland was not abstract. It was water and it was muddy. This warning did not fail because it was hidden. It failed because the person trusted to judge it was also the person whose judgment most needed another judge beside him. That is the center of the St. Francis case. A warning is not complete when it is noticed. It is complete only when the process that receives it is strong enough to challenge the first comfortable answer. At St. Francis, the process bent toward reassurance. The dam had also changed before the collapse. It had been raised 20 feet through two 10-foot changes. The available engineering summaries say those height increases were made without corresponding changes to the base width. That point should be handled carefully. The conclusion is not that the height increase alone caused the failure. The record does not need that simplification. The sharper conclusion is that margin had been reduced in a structure whose foundation was already central to the question. The foundation is the ground and rock that carry the dam and resist the forces around it. A dam can look massive from the downstream side and still depend on assumptions buried under concrete, water, and canyon wall. Those assumptions were not visible during a morning inspection. A person standing at the dam could see leakage. He could see wetness. He could inspect cracks and surfaces. But he could not, in that moment, reopen the design history. He could not give the dam the independent review it never had. He could not make the base wider. He could not make weak ground stronger by deciding that the surface looked safe. That is why the last inspection is so important. It was a real inspection. It was also too small for the question it was being asked to answer. Mulholland's later testimony must be treated as testimony, not proof. Local historical summaries citing the inquest record and later works say, he described the dam as appearing dry or safe after the inspection. At the coroner's hearing, Mulholland said that what he saw did not make him believe the dam was in danger. That matters. It tells what he said. It tells how safety was being interpreted by the man at the center of the system. But it does not prove that the dam was safe. A powerful engineer saying a structure appeared safe is not the same as an independent physical check of the structure. In this case, the central problem is whether too much authority had been given to that appearance. The clock kept moving. Morning passed into afternoon. The reservoir stayed where it was. There was no emergency drawdown, no evacuation order, no public alarm that gave the people downstream a practical chance to act. That absence is not a dramatic quote from one witness. It is the shape of the next 12 hours. The dam keeper had called upward. The chief engineer had come down to the dam. The warning had reached the highest point in the chain. And still, the water remained above the valley. The record cannot tell what each person downstream knew that evening. It cannot enter every house, camp, road, or work site. It cannot say that no rumor moved anywhere, or that every person was in the same state of knowledge. The more careful statement is worse. Most of the people downstream had no practical warning that the reservoir above them was about to move. They were not engineers. They were not members of the Bureau. They had no way to inspect the foundation, read the seepage, or challenge the interpretation made at the wall. They were simply below it, and the keeper was still below it too. The man who had seen the muddy leakage was not in a hearing room. He was not in a later report. He was near the first reach of whatever the dam would do next. The warning had gone upward. The risk had stayed above him. Near midnight, the dam failed. The collapse took place on March 12th into March 13th, 1928. USGS gives the scale without needing embellishment. About 12.4 billion gallons released from the reservoir. A gravity dam is supposed to make water stay still. St. Francis stopped doing that. The stored water became movement. The height behind the dam became force. The reservoir left the canyon wall and entered the valley below. The technical sequence of the collapse is still treated carefully in later analysis. The record should not be forced into a cleaner certainty than it gives. But for the people downstream, the engineering debate arrived as water. The flood first struck the people nearest the dam. That included Tony Harnischfeger, the dam keeper who had reported the muddy leakage. He and his son Cody were among the first killed. Their bodies were never found. There is no need to add anything to that. The keeper saw the sign. The warning moved upward. The reservoir remained full. When the dam failed, he was in the first path of the water. Then the flood moved beyond the dam site into the settlements, camps, and towns downstream. It carried not only water, but debris, force, darkness, and surprise. The collapse scattered the human record as it destroyed lives. Some people were recovered far from where they had been. Some were never recovered at all. That is why the death count must remain careful. USGS gives the conservative count as at least 431 with the exact number unknown. At least 431 is not the whole shape of the loss. It is the floor of the record. The unknown is part of the disaster because the flood exceeded the ordinary machinery of accounting. After the water came the files. The coroner's work had to begin with bodies, names, and causes of death. Julia Rising's name appears in the verdict as one legal doorway into a loss much larger than one file. The jury found that she and others died by drowning and injury caused by the failure of the St. Francis Dam. It classified the deaths as accidental. But accidental did not mean what it can sound like. It did not mean harmless. It did not mean unavoidable. It did not mean the public had been properly protected. The coroner's jury made a careful split. No criminal act or intent, no recommended prosecution, but not no responsibility. The jury placed engineering judgment responsibility on the Los Angeles Bureau and the chief engineer. It pointed to poor underlying rock and unsuitable design and foundation conditions as central to the failure. Then it widened the frame. The verdict also placed public policy responsibility on the broader system that allowed a great dam to depend so heavily on one office. That was the deeper finding. The public did not get a single villain who could explain the collapse by himself. But the verdict did not leave the disaster in the fog of misfortune either. It said that the arrangement had failed. St. Francis was not only a broken dam, it was a broken method of trust. Governor Young's commission mattered because it was intended to stand outside the Bureau's authority. Its lesson was direct: the suitability of foundations and the correctness of design. Those phrases cut through the easier story. The issue was not only whether Mulholland misread one leak on one morning. The issue was whether the dam had been proven safe for its site before anyone was asked to live below it. The coroner's jury made the reform point more explicit. Great dams should not be left to one eminent person without independent expert checking. People below a reservoir cannot perform their own dam review. They cannot inspect ancient landslides inside canyon walls. They cannot calculate uplift, the upward pressure of water beneath a structure. They cannot know whether seepage is harmless or dangerous. That burden belongs to institutions. After St. Francis, California moved towards stronger dam safety oversight. The 1929 Act extended the state engineer's authority to review non-federal dams over defined thresholds and to inspect existing dams. The lesson became more than a verdict sentence. It became a mechanism. That did not make dams risk-free. No law can do that. But it meant that trust in one office was no longer enough. The technical record did not stop with the official inquiries. The coroner's verdict emphasized poor underlying rock and unsuitable design and foundation conditions. Governor Young's commission emphasized foundation, suitability, and correctness of design. Later reassessments, including Rogers and McMahon, argued that the left abutment included an ancient landslide and that earlier investigations focused too much on the right abutment. That later interpretation matters. But it should not be presented as if every investigation saw the same first movement. The honest claim is broader. Foundation, seepage, uplift, and design judgment were inseparable. Water pressure acted on concrete. Concrete depended on rock. Rock carried old weaknesses. Design decisions determined how much margin existed when those forces met. Institutional confidence determined how those signs were read. No single surface observation on the morning of March 12th could resolve all of that. That is why Mulholland's personal responsibility can be both important and incomplete. At the coroner's hearing, Mulholland said he accepted responsibility and framed the error as human error. The statement became part of the public memory because it gave people a man to look at. My read is that the statement may have been sincere, but it was not large enough to hold the whole failure. The verdict gave the public something harder to look at, a system that needed repair. That difference matters. Personal responsibility can clarify. It can also hide structure. A powerful engineer accepting blame may feel like the end of the story, but it does not explain why the dam had no independent design review, why earlier leakage had been normalized, or why the final warning was left to the same authority that had already accepted the dam. Mulholland's testimony that the dam appeared safe belongs in the record. It shows how he described his judgment after the fact. It cannot be allowed to prove the judgment was adequate. The coroner's verdict did something more durable. It held the bureau and chief engineer responsible for engineering judgment, but also identified a public policy failure larger than one man. That is why the ending is not the broken dam alone. It is the hearing room. Mulholland seated beneath questions he could answer only partly. The dam gone, the keeper gone, the reservoir emptied not by decision but by failure. The jury found no criminal act and recommended no prosecution, but it also wrote that no single authority should be allowed to carry such a burden without independent expert checking. Mulholland's career ended within months. California's dam safety oversight grew stronger afterward. Those are the public consequences, but the last image is smaller. At the coroner's hearing, Mulholland sat with the answer everyone wanted from him, but the verdict had already found the larger image. One man's judgment, carrying a reservoir it should never have carried alone.